Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Imagine, Kurt, that you're faced with a choice between picking a dirty nickel off the ground and putting in your mouth, or spending a night in some very well-cleaned pair of Charles Manson's pajamas. What would you prefer?
Charlie Manson's pajamas? Come on. I mean, that's pretty simple, right?
Yeah, it should be, right? But we know that preferences and actions aren't always 100% in sync, but the answer to this question is an indicator on where you stand on magical thinking.
Oh.
Magical thinking is closely linked to your willingness to believe in conspiracy theories.
In case you're not familiar with conspiracy theories, our guest, Eric Oliver from the University of Chicago, gave us a working definition. A conspiracy theory is one where
believing that there is some sort of unseen intentional force that's causing something to happen and accepting that as an explanation over something that's empirically verifiable.
And more than just standard political reasons for polarization, his work suggests that what divides us most are the divergent worldviews between intuitionists and rationalists, the difference between favoring an emotional lens on our world compared to a more rational view of the world. And I'm here to tell you this, the differences are huge.
Part of our polarization and the problem that we have in terms of conversing as a country is that it's not simply ideology that's dividing us, it's really this kind of worldview or ontology that's really separating.
Eric Oliver teaches at the University of Chicago, where he is a professor of political science. However, his work is closely linked to psychologists such as Jonathan Haidt, and the way Eric talks about his research is very much in line with social psychologists and sociologists. His observations come from more than 20 years of research, and as the author of 5 books on political science, we were pleased to have him as a guest, and we're big fans of his work for some time.
Yeah, just to tee things up for you, we spoke to Eric about how liberals and conservatives name their children, which was kind of fun.
That was.
The rise of intuitionism, having dinner with a sports star rather than a rock star, and of course, conspiracy theories. And after that, Kurt and I groove on some key concepts, and then we wrap things up with a bonus track and groove idea for the week.
Before we dive into our conversation, I just want to remind you that for less than the cost of just one pumpkin spice latte each month, you could be supporting Behavioral Groove's mission to expand the community of people applying behavioral science to work and life.
So please join the other supporters at our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/behavioral grooves and pledge the amount that's right for you.
Now it's time to sit back with your intuitive and rational recliner with a cup of conspiracy theory and enjoy our conversation with Eric Oliver.
Eric Oliver, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we are excited to have you. And as we mentioned earlier, we start with a speed round. So I'm going to start it off, Tim, if you're okay with that.
You go right ahead, Kurt.
Yeah. All right.
What questions have you got in your head this morning?
Would you rather have dinner with your favorite sports star or your favorite musician?
Probably my favorite sports star, because I always have this problem. The more I know about my favorite musicians, the less I like them.
Oh, okay.
That's a good way of looking at it, right? Gonna keep that image up there.
I like to keep my musicians in an aura of mystery.
Oh, see, there's good conversations around that later. We'll definitely come back to that. So, would you rather learn a new instrument or a new language?
A new instrument. I'm terrible with languages.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah,
what new instrument comes to mind? What would
I actually just started playing piano last year. So we bought a house, and part of the negotiation of a house came with a piano. And I was like, oh, I've got this piano. Maybe I should start learning it. So
cool.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. All right. Coffee or tea?
A coffee.
Coffee. All right.
No hesitation on that. Some implicit bias, I think. What about true or false? Do liberals choose different names for their children than conservatives do?
Yes, they do. On average.
All right. So we know that you've done some research on this. So get into that a little bit if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I was working with some graduate students, and we were trying to figure out whether or not liberals and conservatives have different tastes, like consumer tastes. And the problem with measuring most consumer taste is that they're endogenous to what producers are making. So, Subaru markets their cars to liberals, and you can think like, probably chewing tobacco markets it to conservatives. And so we're trying to figure out what would be an indicator of kind of consumptive behavior that nobody really markets anything about. And baby names came out. So we started doing all this research on baby names. And basically what we found out was that baby names relates to where you are on the socioeconomic spectrum. So the higher your socioeconomic status, the more likely you are to use a kind of conventional or traditional baby name. But where you see a big differentiation is amongst the upper strata is between conservatives and liberals. And conservatives continue to name their children with traditional ways, but liberals begin choosing less usual names, both for boys and for girls. And the difference between your sort of upper status liberals and kind of lower socioeconomic status people is that when lower status people are choosing unusual names, they're basically oftentimes making the names up, or they're choosing crass commercial products like Hennessy, for example, or Pepsi. So, you go through the actual list of baby names, and you just, wow, people are really naming their kids this. Whereas liberals, we think, are actually kind of signaling their cultural capital. Conservatives, I think, with baby names, like they signal economic capital, and liberals typically having more cultural capital than economic capital, like to signal their cultural capital. So you start seeing names like, Emerson, Shaw, Esme, these kind of obscure literary artistic references. And so now I go around like my kid's school, and I look the names of the locker, and I'm like, liberal. Oh, and the other interesting thing is that liberals tend to choose more feminine sounding names. If you go through and you look at like most girls and boys names tend to have a lot of hard consonants, like ka and ta and sounds. And liberals tend to have more like e's and ahs, and they like that schwa, at the end of a name like Ella, Emma. And so if you want to find out whether or not someone's parents are conservative, like a girl whose name is Taylor, odds are conservative parents. And, to me, the great sort of emblematic test case of this was if you look at the Obama kids, Sasha and Malia, very melodic, liberally sounding names. And if you look at Sarah Palin's kids, like Track, Trig, Piper, Bristol, like kind of sounding Alaskan names. So
very interesting.
It just plays out. How did you match the data up? How did you match birth names with ideological thinking?
Sure. So that was a bit of a challenge, but luckily the state of California has a lot of kids born every year. About 500,000 kids are born in California every year, and you could apply and get the data. And what we got from that were the names and addresses of all the birth mothers, and the birth records also had some information about the mother's socioeconomic status, but they obviously don't have anything about their political orientation. So what we could do is, based on where the mothers were living, we could look at sort of the voting patterns in their precincts, and so we could basically see if they are in liberal neighborhoods or conservative neighborhoods. Now, obviously, you might have some, liberals living in conservative neighborhoods and vice versa. But, when you have that many cases, you can get a pretty good indicator of what you would find. And I think the thing that was remarkable for us is that we actually found these patterns. I mean, the fact that
right, that it exists.
Yeah. That there are these kind of very clear, demonstrable differences in naming behavior across this was really astounding for us.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating that we can go through our kids' school now and look and see the kids' names and go, oh, probably coming from a conservative family or coming from a liberal family. That'll be very interesting. Once we actually go back to school, I'll now have this whole new game to play when I go in to the schools. So that's fascinating. I know you've done a lot of work too on conspiracy theories and how people, different kind of aspects of conspiracy theories. And one of the things that Tim and I talk about is this magical thinking aspect of that. That is one of the aspects that lends itself into that arena. Can you talk a little bit about some of the background of the conspiracy theory research, and then what your research is pointing to? And I know it's pretty broad, so we'll probably narrow in on it as we go.
Sure. So it actually started for me in the mid-90s. I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and I was walking down Telegraph Avenue, and this guy came up to me and said, "Hey, man, you got to read this." And he handed me this sheet of paper, and it had this little scrawl, and it was this elaborate conspiracy theory involving Queen Elizabeth and the Trilateral Commission and the Illuminati. And, there are a lot of crazy people running around Berkeley. And, I immediately, my first inclination was like, another Berkeley crazy. But I was also thinking a lot about how people think about politics and how they understand their political world. And it occurred to me that, this guy was going out of his way to sort of, disseminate this worldview that he had. And this worldview was not captured in any of our models within political science about how people understand politics. It was just completely out of that realm. And rather than think of this guy as kooky, I have enough. I'm from Texas, and I have enough relatives back in Texas who also believe in these types of conspiracy theories. I was like, this guy's not alone. So I was thinking about it, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Well, fast forward about 10 years, and I had some room on some surveys that I was doing. And I thought about this guy and I said, well, let me put on a few conspiracy theories and see what kind of support is out there. And what blew me away is I think I asked about 6 different conspiracy theories, and about half of the public agreed with at least one of them. And I remember I showed this at a conference, and there was a big uproar, and everyone was like, "No, that can't be. No. I was like, "No, really, this is what the data are." So I knew I was kind of onto something, because my colleagues were really mad at me.
always a good measure.
Yeah. So I started kind of looking into this, and the thing that really leapt out as trying to figure out, well, what is it that predicts whether or not people believe in conspiracy theories? And the biggest correlates that were out there was whether or not you had a lot of paranormal and supernatural beliefs. And that kind of was interesting. It's like, well, why that in particular? And what had occurred to me was the sort of underlying theme that connected conspiracy theories with these other types of beliefs, this magical thinking. And when we talk about magical thinking, what we basically mean is believing that there is some sort of unseen intentional force that's causing something to happen, and accepting that as an explanation over something that's empirically verifiable. So that, magical thinking has a kind of pejorative context. So let me explain. If you live on your, little tropical island, and you believe that, you got to throw teenagers into the volcano every year to keep the volcano god happy. If you don't know anything about plate tectonics or geology, that might be your science, and that's not necessarily magical thinking. But if someone comes along and sort of says, no, it's actually volcanoes come from things that have nothing to do with volcano gods, then that becomes, and you still do it, then that's magical thinking. And so what's interesting is why is it that people persist in their magical beliefs, and trying to think about what is the appeal of magical thinking and why is it so pervasive? Max Weber, the founder of sociology, predicted about 100 years ago. He said, he saw the disenchantment of the West, and he said, we're moving away from the sort of the magical beliefs that animated the medieval mind, and we're moving to this sort of science, more rationalist orientation. And if you look at the United States, there's still large numbers of people who really reject science and reject a rationalist framework. Max Weber might have said, "What is going on here? This is not what I predict." And so I was trying to think about, okay, well, what's behind magical thinking? Why do people find magical thinking so much more compelling than, say, a scientific or a rationalist framework? And so I started doing research into psychology and anthropology around magical beliefs, and kind of what came to mind is that magical thinking, I think, is seductive for us and powerful for us because it represents our intuitive ways of understanding the world. That it draws on these intuitions. And I think it draws on these intuitions in 2 ways. one of the ways it draws on our intuitions is that when we understand the world, we don't do it through a purely cognitive framework. We draw on our emotions, and our emotions are important for us in two ways. They're important because they motivate our thinking in particular ways, and they also inform our thinking. And when you face the world, and the world is a big, complicated place with a lot of uncertainty, and that typically generates a lot of anxiety for us. We don't like to feel uncertain. Anxiety is an uncomfortable position. And so we try to placate our anxiety as much as we can. And a lot of magical thinking comes about trying to placate anxiety. If you think about like who are really big chronic magical thinkers, people who have a lot of superstitions, it's people who are engaged in activities where there's an uncertain outcome. So like deep sea fishermen, for example, are notoriously superstitious. Baseball players, things, soldiers, same way, gamblers, all of these types of people really rely on a lot of superstitious beliefs, and they're trying to basically manage their own anxiety in the context of great uncertainty. But the other thing that happens is that when we have these emotions, we also draw on them as informative. And I give an example about this is my son, Ethan, when he was 5, I went to his bedroom. He was, complaining about monsters in the closet. And we had this whole, this is like 11:30 at night. I'm really tired. He's tired. Getting nowhere on this. And finally he turns to me and said, well, Dad, if there are no monsters in the closet, then why am I afraid? And
yeah.
Okay, all right, you got me. Good night. So, but I realize that's he basically, and I think this is when we draw on our intuitions. If we're feeling apprehensive, we're actually more likely to then look and seek answers that sort of validate or rationalize our fears. And the irony of that is, in the short run, that may placate us. So when it comes to a conspiracy theory, if I think like, there's a secret group of small, powerful Illuminati that are out there that are making the world happen, that may give me a sense, okay, I finally know what's going on. I know why coronavirus is happening now. They are out there sort of making coronavirus happen. But on the other hand, it reaffirms this notion that, wow, there are really this nefarious, powerful, evil people out there that are controlling things. So it may sustain my anxiety or sustain a kind of chronic anxiety.
Is it tied into locus of control at all?
I didn't really measure or look at that, but I assume it is. I think there are there's a sort of constellation of different psychological propensities that are around there. And I think one of the things that comes up, and you see this a lot, are, people with a lot of OCD syndromes, obsessive compulsive behavior. And I think that's probably also, akin to, in some sort of Venn diagram with locus of control.
And what about, is there, I think about Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations, and, I'm not aware of you doing any of this work specifically, but do you have any intuitions that there's a map across the kinds of things that would lead someone to be, high or low on any of those 5 foundations, sanctity and purity and stuff like that? So
I've had some back and forth with John about this. I think a lot of his measures, I'm not really convinced that they're actually measures of, some sort of innate propensities. And one of the reasons why is that I did a study which we presented at some conferences, but for a variety of reasons, we haven't been able to get published, which examines his sort of do liberals and conservatives really rely differently on these different moral foundations? And the fact of the matter is those differences really disappear once you control for whether or not people are religiously fundamentalist and evangelical beliefs. And so it's really, it's religious conservatives in the United States who really rely on purity, authority, loyalty, that those really emphasize us. Now, the difficulty is that because, we have a selection of certain kinds of people who have those innate proclivities, or because they're in these kind of belief systems, which actually reinforce, if you look at most evangelical conservative Christian beliefs, they really reinforce purity,
authority,
loyalty. So, I think that becomes a difficult issue. Jonathan's work, though, was very inspiring for my own, and in a lot of ways, particularly some of his early work, because the second part of magical thinking that I think relates to this is when people are trying to make sense of the world, they do rely heavily on certain kinds of heuristics and these sort of shortcuts to understanding and making inferences. And Jonathan's work, particularly on disgust and some of his early stuff, really inspired my work on this in terms of thinking about, okay, how might we measure sort of a sensitivity towards certain kinds of heuristics? And so I think there's a little bit more in terms of when we start thinking about moral foundations, there is a sense that these are heuristics that people tap into, right? And so to give you, an example, James Frazier, who wrote The Golden Bough, with this big compendium of magical beliefs that was collected in the late 19th century. And he had this idea that there were basically two kinds of magical beliefs. One that we would actually call these heuristics now. So one is a contagion heuristic, and the idea we think that if we have contact with something that is good or belong to, like, say, a saint or the Pope, that it has magical qualities that are good for us. And similarly, if we have contact with something that's been, in contact with someone like Charles Manson or Hitler, it may be tainted and it's bad. And that's, that sense of, kids have this sense of cooties, for example. And so that's, I think, an important heuristic. I think this idea of a representativeness heuristic is also important. So we think that things that look like other things will share their qualities for them. And, we tested this out early on when kind of doing research on, I was with my graduate students, and we had a survey question, and we divided respondents up into two groups. And we asked them, the first group, we said, suppose you were going to play for a $2 million lottery. And a friend said that he had won a lottery by rubbing his lottery ticket for the first half of the group, we said a paper napkin, and said, would you rub a lottery ticket on a paper napkin? And about 40% of people said that they would do that. And in the second half of the group, we basically said, would you rub your lottery ticket on a dollar bill? And does that seem like a good thing? And about 60% said that they would do that. So we get a much bigger difference. People are much more likely to sort of rub lottery tickets on dollar bills than paper napkins. And of course, that makes perfect sense, because of course, rubbing a lottery ticket on a dollar bill is going to be much more effective for you.
Of course. Right. Who doesn't know that? Right.
So, but that's kind of how these heuristics work. And I think a lot of what John's work was getting into was trying to, I think, or what inspired me from his work was trying to think a little bit more about how these heuristics might operate, particularly when it comes to magical beliefs. So bringing this all back to conspiracy theories, what we see in conspiracy theories is not only are they fueled by anxiety and apprehension, but they really rely heavily on a lot of heuristics. A representativeness heuristic, you can think an availability heuristic, people look at the sort of range of circumstances. They look at sort of just immediate information. I think an anthropomorphizing heuristic is really, really important here. So if you look at a lot of conspiracy narratives, they give a singular intentionality to things like, the CIA wants this, or, Wall Street wants this, as if these, very complex, multidimensional organizations, have a mind of their own.
Yeah. I have some family members who remind me every time we see a jet go over that the white stuff that is behind the engines is disseminating some kind of control over us. That's not just jet fuel vaporizing in the atmosphere, that there really is something about that is controlling us specifically. And boy, haven't you noticed that there's more of them today than there were 10 years ago? And they've got all the rationale for it. It's like, wow, it's really hard to have the discussion with them too.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. This is something that now that you mentioned that, I'd like to follow up, because one of the side effects of the COVID shutdown has been the absence of air traffic. And people think that I'd be very curious to see how our vapor trail conspiracy theorists are now interpreting this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. I heard on NPR this morning, they were talking about there was actually measuring the blueness of the sky, and in April it was bluer than it has been for a long time because of that. But now summer and you get dust and farming and other things that are going on. It's not.
I have to ask that question though. I have to go back to my in-laws and just say, by the way, who's controlling us now if it's not, the chemtrails?
Yeah.
So have you noticed or have you done any research on has conspiracy theories increased given COVID? Have we become more of a kind of this world that, hey, obviously something is going on, or is it just the continuation of what's been happening in the past and now it's just replaced with masks and China went out and did this on purpose and all the other conspiracy theories that we're hearing?
Yeah. So I have not had something in the field in the past couple of months, so I don't know specifically, but I have been basically asking in surveys pretty much every other year for about 15 years now about conspiracy theories. And the levels are pretty constant.
Okay.
It's usually about half the population. And we might see a little more. I mean, COVID is just ripe terrain for conspiracies, because we still know so little about the pathology. It's affecting everyone. There's people the world is just ripe for misinformation about this. There's a lot of politically motivated misinformation that's out there. There are a lot of kind of grifters who are out there basically trying to promote themselves by kind of putting forth false conspiracy theories. But I don't know if, so we can see that people probably have a lot of conspiracy theories about COVID. One of the things I do know from my research is that health conspiracy theories tend to be amongst the most popular.
Okay.
And the reason is that they oftentimes, political conspiracy theories oftentimes either have liberal or conservative political conspiracy theories. There are not a lot of them that travel across the ideological spectrum. Health conspiracy theories, on the other hand, do. So, for example, I've asked this question on a number of surveys. Do you think the Food and Drug Administration is deliberately withholding natural cures for cancer because of secret pressure from the pharmaceutical industry? And you get like 45% of Americans believing in this. And that's across the idea, conservatives and liberals equally likely to.
I know you've done some work on credulity too, right? And this idea of, how open we are to just believing things and how that plays into, again, belief in these conspiracy theories and other things. Can you talk a little bit about that and in particular about the scale that you've developed around that? Is that?
Sure. So this was work. I had an undergraduate, this brilliant undergraduate who came to me a couple of years ago, and she said, I'm interested in misinformation. And I said, well, why don't we start working on something together? And we basically we're trying to figure out, can you measure, Abraham Lincoln famously said, you can fool some of the people some of the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And well, can you? And who can you fool? So, we were kind of curious about that. No one ever tested Lincoln's, motto as far as and the big challenge in measuring credulity, though, is how do you figure out whether or not you're actually measuring? Are some people just more credulous? Are some people more likely to believe something? And the difficulty is most of what we believe depends on the message and the messenger. So we're far more likely to believe something if it comes from a trusted source or someone who we like. So if, I'm conservative, if Sean Hannity tells me something, I'm much more likely to believe it. If I'm liberal and Rachel Maddow tells me something, I'm far more likely to believe what she tells me. And similarly, we're probably more likely to believe things based on the message itself. Does it have cues about, things, say, our partisanship or our ideology? And so what we try to do is try to figure out, are there things out there that might predict someone's credulity regardless, can we figure out things that the message, it's completely indifferent to the message itself? And so we did a battery of like 50 items, kind of going through with the survey, trying to figure out, and we ended up coming up with some things that we wanted to have, some things that were true and some things that were false in this, because when we encounter the world, we're encountering true and false information. We have to differentiate. And, part of the fear right now with misinformation is not just that we're duping a lot of people to believing the wrong thing. But that the flip side of it is that people have gotten so skeptical now that they're rejecting positive information. And we see this with COVID, like people, are afraid to, for example, to wear masks or get vaccines because they don't trust anything and they don't trust any information that they're getting. So we came up with a scale of this, and we had some items that would be kind of uncertain, and we were just curious your likelihood of believing them. So things like drinking a cup of coffee before you take a nap will allow you to wake up actually being much more alert than if you just took a nap without a cup of coffee. And that happens to be true. I guess there was a study that showed this, and so we asked something like that, or do you think does the U.S. Produce as much steel as it used to? We just hire fewer steel makers because the steel is so much more efficient than it used to be, and so giving that statement, and
which doesn't sound true to me. We're producing less steel, right?
Yeah, we are producing less steel.
Okay. I feel like I'm taking the test. I'm sorry.
There are those kind of items. So, so we had a series of items like that, and then based on that, we tried to see, okay, how well does this then predict if how you score on this? Does this predict your willingness to then take what is politically motivated misinformation, or we gave people, they were taking surveys online, and so we gave them the kind of news feeds that they might get in Facebook or Twitter. Recreated some of those. We asked them conspiracy theories, and basically what we ended up finding is that I think the good news is that most people are kind of in the middle of the scale. And they sort of will accept some things as true and some things as false. And, people aren't necessarily overly skeptical or overly credulous. Probably about 2% of the country in our sample, or at least 2% of our sample, is highly credulous. Will just sort of seemingly believe anything. And about 5% are overly skeptical, and they're just overly rejecting everything. But the vast majority of people, I think, are pretty agnostic. They're in the middle. So that, I think, that's probably some good news.
Well, that's much better than I would have predicted, prior to reading the study. It's one of those things. I would have thought that would have been much greater on both ends of that spectrum. So it is good news.
Oh, yeah. So, and it still doesn't get rid of the problem of misinformation, because you still have a lot of partisan ideological biases, worldview biases coming in that are influencing people's views, obviously. But most people aren't dupes. I
wanted to get back to the idea of the likelihood for someone who is believing in religious, the magical thinking relationship to kind of religious beliefs, that within the evangelical Christian community, there is maybe a higher likelihood. What about just Christianity, Islam, Judaism, kind of in general, when it comes to likelihood to favor conspiracy theories?
So
compared to someone who is professing an agnosticism or
sure. And I think that the difficulty with that comes, and this is what we found in our research, which was, I, for example, I was raised Catholic. I probably still, I don't go to church anymore. I don't believe in God, but I still have probably a lot of, intellectual baggage.
Yeah.
But I still, carry around a lot of beliefs and ideas, from my childhood, growing up being Catholic. And I think a lot of people, when they describe themselves as religious, it's not really a well thought out set. They believe in God, or they believe in certain ideas because that was there, but that's not necessarily informing their worldview. It's just this, it's like I go to, church on Christmas and Easter because it's this ritual, and I kind of do it. And I kind of believe maybe there's some force out there that's great. But then there are people who are really active in terms of understanding the world through a religious framework. And in the book, I quote a woman I was talking to once, and she had all of these different views. Some were liberal and some conservatives. They were very, very inconsistent with one another. Like she, on the one hand, was really into organic foods and natural medicines, and she thought the government should do more to support the poor and take care of the elderly. On the other hand, she really hated Obamacare, and she thought that, Barack Obama was a secret Muslim, and she didn't really talk about what Obamacare did. She didn't really even know. And we were talking back and forth, and finally she said, the difference between you and me, Eric, is that you believe in reason and I believe in the Bible. And I know that was a very prescient thing for her to say, because she was saying, like, I just don't have a worldview. Like, facts don't matter to me the way they matter to you. And for me, it's a worldview of, she wasn't saying this, but I think implicit in that was her worldview is motivated by symbols and metaphors and a whole different way of sort of understanding things. And so when we talk about religion here and conspiracy theories, I think what's important is to what extent religion reinforces a magical worldview. And a lot of religions out there, if you think about like Satan in some ways, the idea of Satan is kind of a conspiracy theory. There's this sort of secret force out there that's making bad things happen and, kind of doing things out there. A lot of apocalyptic thinking, I think, reinforces this too, this idea of this kind of grand narrative that's going on. And, the interesting thing that I think apocalyptic thinking and conspiracy theories have in common is that they put the thinker at the center of the narrative. So, if I believe in a conspiracy theory, somehow or another, I'm empowered and I have this secret knowledge now. And I'm now part of this narrative, and I'm understanding, and maybe I'm even, by propagating the conspiracy theory, I'm fighting against it, and I see myself in that. And, these sort of end times narratives are the same way. Like, now is, this is the time when we're actually, the rapture is going to happen. It didn't happen 50 years ago. And it's not going to happen 50 years from now. It's happening now because there's a sort of narcissism there that it kind of promotes. And so I think there's a commonality in that. And so that's when in my research on kind of magical thinking, I was trying to come up with ways of capturing this type of kind of intuitionism, a way of someone who relies more on their intuitions and as a way of understanding the world. Because I think that's what really the difference between the key aspect. It's not religion per se. It's the kind of intuitive worldview that religion really promotes and fosters, that then makes people sort of susceptible to conspiracy theories.
So it sounds like there's a fundamentalism here. So regardless of whether it's Christianity or Islam, if it's that fundamentalist belief in the absolute word of whatever the text that they're believing in, that lends itself into that, which goes to your other point, which you're talking about, this idea of if I know this conspiracy theory, I'm somehow special and I have some aspect of it. That fundamentalism also is that I'm special. I am one of the chosen people to be there. So there's some correlation there. Any thoughts on that? Is that something that you've looked at, or?
Yeah, I mean, so like, for example, one of the biggest predictors of whether or not you believe in conspiracy theories is, if you believe that we're living in end times. Yeah. The other thing that, we were sort of talking about some measures, and, one of the things that we came up with in the book is we try to come up with some scales about, how much people rely on their intuitions when they're making judgments. And this goes back to your kind of lightning questions, so we came up with a bunch of items that tap into to what extent people evaluate or weigh these heuristics when they make their choices. So we ask people things like, for example, would you rather stab a photograph of your family 5 times with a sharp knife, or stick your hand in a bowl of cockroaches? Or, would you rather sleep in laundry pajamas once worn by Charles Manson, or, pick a dirty nickel off the ground and put it in your mouth? And we had a series of choices where people are basically having to evaluate things with sort of symbolic cost versus tangible cost.
Yeah.
And, where you were on this scale is enormously predictive of, having magical beliefs, but also kind of believing in conspiracy theories. And then when it comes to politics, I was doing this research I started this research in 2014. Started writing this book in 2014. In 2015 was doing these surveys here. And then Donald Trump comes on the scene.
Yeah.
And then, so here you have a political figure who is, an intuitionist par excellence. He's just, he doesn't want to think very hard. He's just going with his gut. And he admits this, and he says, my gut is right. And if you look at his political rhetoric, it captures this. And if you look at why people are so enamored with him, it's because he is actually speaking to this intuitive way of worldview. So it's, it's not simply a coincidence that he also, promotes conspiracy theories and has this conspiracy theory way of thinking, or, he tries to align himself with the religious right, and the whole, the photo op of going out and holding up the Bible. He was very unsure about this book that he was holding, but, he was kind of promoted that way. And, sure enough, when we did surveys during the primaries, the people who were sort of really strongly populist were really in favor of Donald Trump, and also had a high level of conspiracy theories. And, that sort of mistrust of power, that mistrust of scientific elites, of cultural elites, that sort of is emblematic of populism, really also speaks to kind of an intuitionist framework, and kind of comes together with conspiracy theory. They're right too.
And his rhetoric is reinforcing that within those people as well, from what we can see, right? I mean, it's that disbelief in media, making sure that there's this idea that there are, China is behind the vaccine or the coronavirus, and all of those factors that go into that.
Prior to the coronavirus happening, it wasn't necessarily catastrophic, but now I think people are beginning to realize, at least a significant portion of the population is beginning to realize the sort of limitations. I think the flip side of that is, I often see this as like Donald Trump has poor approval ratings right now. It's somewhere around 40%, and a lot of people say, well, who are the 40% who actually do approve of him? And I think it's important for people probably who listen to podcasts like this, that we are in a bubble that's very separated from the rest of the world in terms of, in my surveys, typically 30% of people still say that we're living in end times as foretold by biblical prophecy. And I imagine, like, if you actually do hold that as a sincere belief, then the world must be just potent with symbols. Everywhere you go, you're looking for some validation or some, idea that's going to be a part of this narrative that's coming forward. And so that's just a very different way of understanding things. And one of the things that I think has happened in American politics is that conservatism has become a much more intuitionist kind of ideological movement than it used to be. And I think liberalism on the flip side has become a more rationalist kind of movement. And we see this in our data. And I know, like in Hyde Park, where we live, it's a pretty liberal community. And, you see the signs, you probably see these in Minneapolis too, where it's the liberal mantra, the sort of the things liberals believe in, they put it in the front yard. Like, we believe that love is love. Yep. Black Lives Matter and science is real, and it's an interesting idea of sort of staking this claim to rationalism on the left. And conversely, on the right, if you look at the rhetoric, just the mistrust of the science around COVID, for example, really speaks to this. And I think that's part of our polarization and the problem that we have in terms of conversing as a country, is that it's not simply ideology that's dividing us, it's really this kind of worldview or ontology that's really separating us. And, it's very hard for rationalists and intuitionists to sort of talk to each other.
So that leads me to ask, are there any tips for how to deal with, let's say, if someone in this conversation happened to have some relatives that were really big conspiracy theorists? Are there any tips on how to have a conversation with them? So I have two thoughts on this. The first one is, empirically speaking, I don't know. I haven't. I got a media question from this a couple of weeks ago, and they asked me very specifically, were there any kind of clinical trials where you try to communicate with people? And I was like, I don't know. But the wisdom I've kind of gleaned on this from talking to others, and this goes back to, when my son was in his room worried about the monsters in the closet. Me trying to rationalize the monsters away was not going to make the monsters go away from him. Me listening to him and saying, I hear you, I understand you, seemed to help. And I think when we try to speak to across this ontological divide, this worldview divide, at least just trying to empathize first and trying to recognize that you're just not going to reason your way out of this, and that no amount of reasoning is going to work. But like trying to listen to what the other side says and
hear what is animating their concerns, what is animating their apprehensions here. I think it's a pretty good first step. And then trying to sort of gently bring in, well, if you feel this way, then wouldn't you also feel this way about something that, maybe is a concern for you? But the whole "you're wrong and this is why" it just never works.
Yeah, Laurie Santos's G.I. Joe fallacy comes to mind, that knowing is not even close to half the battle.
Yeah.
That isn't going to help
Well,
us.
and you get the backfire effect too, right? You get this pushback that they actually go further down that road of believing, because it's now part of their self-identity, and you're questioning that, and then they have to redouble down on that, which is, lots of the end of times, cults that have been studied, where, they predict it's going to be, whatever the date is, and that date comes and passes, and they're like, well, they just double down. Well, because of what we've done, we've saved the world, and now that end date is moved up 5 years or whatever it would be.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, so we have to start talking about music now, because this could be great. So you said that you would prefer to learn a new instrument. You've got a new piano in the house.
Yeah.
First of all, do you play other instruments?
No, just piano. I hit the bongo drums maybe.
Okay. Bass players would tend to say that drummers really aren't musicians, but that's the way musicians are. So, what's on your playlist right now? What are you listening to?
Spotify has totally damaged my sense of what I'm listening to, because I don't really know a lot of what I'm listening to anymore. It was funny. I was really into indie music when I was young, and then I had kids, and then I went to an indie show, and I immediately said, could they turn it down? It's really loud. and the worst was, like, I was looking at the guys on stage, and I was like, oh my God, their parents must be so proud of them. And I was like, oh, I'm just. And I had this period of not listening to music from the time my kids were born until a couple of years ago. And then I kind of was going back and rediscovering all of this music that I had missed. Like I had kind of missed LCD Sound System. And I was like, oh my God, these guys are amazing. And I've been really enjoying, like, Kurt Weill and Courtney Barnett. So as far as kind of reclaiming music that I kind of missed. So I would say that's in heavy rotation for me right now. And then I have a 15-year-old now. Of course, she wants to sort of share with me all of these kind of new music and new songs. And I don't know.
You're loving it, right?
It's great. Yeah. But I have no idea who these are.
I do have to say that kids expand that musical genre that I'm listening to, at least. I know I'm not a big pop person, and my daughter, who's 10, is big into all the pop stuff, and so I listen to that, and so I know most of those songs now. And my son is into rap, and the 14-year-old son, and he's into that, so I've learned some of those. It has expanded my musical listening palette, I would say.
Are you one who can listen to music while you're working?
If it's either classical or, like, sometimes when I'm writing, I'll listen to, like, say, Philip Glass. And I find that actually very stimulating. I feel like, I must be doing something. I'm listening to this elevating music. So that I'm getting,
it's like a prime or a prompt.
Yeah. So, it's helpful in that regard.
Wow. How that's the first time we asked this question of a lot of people. We're actually kind of partnering with Melanie Brooks at Columbia. She's doing some research on music while you work, and so we're kind of just collecting some anecdotal thoughts on this. But no one has ever said that they listen to music to sort of prompt them that they're doing something important. That's a new one.
It says more about my ego than anything else. Or my ego needs.
I could see that, though. It's the soundtrack to your work, right? And there's a soundtrack to the movies, right? We know when something important is going on because the music changes, and that's part of that underlying, aspect of movies and all of those facets. So.
Yeah. And then getting back to the earlier comment about you wouldn't really want to have dinner with a favorite musician because you don't want to get to know them too much. I had the opportunity to be backstage at a Stephen Stills concert, and who is my guitar hero, in 1977, and he was coked out of his mind, and the whole backstage area was just a big drug fest. And I was a pretty young guy at the time, and it was really disappointing for me to be around this guy who I just thought was a guitar god, and it really deflated my impression of him. And then it was like I worked hard to separate the art from the artist, for many years. And I was like, fuck it, I can't figure that out. I can't do that. So tell me about your rationale for this idea that you wouldn't want to know too much about the artist.
Well, it goes back to I'll either hear interviews or read interviews with people whose work I really admire, and then you read it and you're like, oh my God, you're such a dodo. or you're an awful person. I was thinking about I read Keith Richards, biography.
That was the same one I was going to. Exactly same thought.
I thought he basically could have, titled it The Unenlightened One. It was like, oh man, Keith, wow, you're really petty. Well,
I heard an interview with him on NPR, and I can't remember with it who, and I just thought, oh my God, you are such a misogynist kind of idiot that it blew me. I'm going to go, and I can't listen to a Rolling Stones album the same way. So yeah, it's really, really kind of fascinating. So you did say though that you go with your sports. Who would that be? Who would you want to have dinner with from your sports fan?
Oh wow. Who would I want to? Depends on what we're eating, I suppose.
Well, you were born in Texas, but you live in Chicago now. I mean, do you have a Chicago fan base as a Texas?
Yeah, no, I haven't really adopted the Chicago sports teams. I'm still
okay. That's good.
My Houston teams that I kind of grew up with, but the people who I don't know if these count as sports fans, but there are a couple of NBA coaches.
Yeah,
who are pretty cool. So Steve Kerr, I would love to hang out with.
Oh,
he's like a great guy.
Yeah.
And so, in some ways, I think they would be better during time conversations. I don't know if they count as sports stars, though.
But Steve Kerr played. I mean, he was, he was on the Chicago Bulls for that so long, and all that. So, but yeah, I would agree. Popovich is another one who I would love to just sit down and have a dinner with, just because I think their thought process is so fascinating to think about, how they're not only thinking about the game and the game mechanics, but also the personalities of the team, and how do you motivate these egos that are huge, and those two I think do it really well.
Yeah, I think so. Colin Kaepernick would probably be an interesting dinner time guest too. Just like, how is this happening to you?
And what's it like to be him?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, at this time. Well, Eric, thank you. This has been absolutely enlightening, fun, and I've just been thoroughly enjoying it, and I'm sure our listeners will too. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you guys and great to chat. So thanks for all your interest in my work too.
It's great. Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our conversation with the amazing Eric Oliver, have a free-flowing discussion, and talk about whatever else comes into our magically enhanced brains.
Yeah, magical thinking. Yeah,
magical thinking. Unicorns and
fairy tales.
Fairies. There you go.
Exactly.
Pretty interesting stuff.
Fantastic. We covered so much ground with Eric. I really just loved it. And when thinking about this grooving session, I think you said it really well, Kurt, that we don't really have easy things that we can just chunk out. That really what we covered is how we think about things. right?
Yeah, I mean, that was the cool thing about this, from a political scientist talking about thinking, right? And this
Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
that we think, and again, intuitive or rational, right? So is it that gut feeling? Is it this more processed thought of, hey, yeah, let's look at the data and figure out and run things? Or do you just run with what you're feeling? And it was a really insightful distinction. Again, because I had made the assumption, right, of conspiracy theories and different pieces. It was conservative versus liberal bias, or a Republican Democratic kind of thing, and in fact, it's not. It is some very different underlying root causes. So, yeah,
I love this too, and that lens really helped me focus on what the current political divide is really based on. And so when I've heard people who support Trump say, well, Trump says what I've been thinking sort of in my heart for a long time. It isn't these outlandish, claims about anything in particular. It's the fact that he's just going with his gut.
yeah.
Right. That he just plays from this is how I feel rather than this is how I think. And I think that that's probably one of the things that irritates the liberals the most, is that he's not rational. Right. He just does. He's not interested in playing in a rational field. He's interested in playing from the intuition side of in his emotions. That's
this idea of this is how I feel, not how I think is just spot on, right? And then that ties into, I think, a lot of how people are doing this, which gets into why having discussions or arguments or trying to persuade somebody out of a gut feel is so difficult, because logical, rational kind of thoughts are not where they're coming from. So you can't persuade somebody from a gut feeling with rational components. It goes back to, who are we talking with? This idea of trying to convince somebody of something from a moral foundation versus from a rational thing. Andy Luttrell, right? When we were talking with Andy Luttrell, who will be a podcast that's coming up, was talking through like persuading people who believe something from a moral ground point. If you're giving them all these facts and figures, but you're not touching on that moral framework that they're basing their belief on, it doesn't matter all the facts and figures that you do. And that's kind of the same thing of this gut feel.
And in one-to-one conversations, Andy seemed to say the same thing, if I recall rightly, as Eric is saying. If you're in a one-on-one conversation with someone, the first thing to do is be empathetic. Just listen. Just listen. We need to listen to the other side. We listen to people who don't have the same worldview as us, and just be empathetic and try to understand. That Kwame Christian talked about as well. The first thing we need to do is be empathetic. And that I love hearing our guests focus on that as an important takeaway for us as listeners and as we live in the world. This is something that could really help us, is just to be more empathetic.
Well, and you have to be empathetic when 50% of the public, or almost 50% of the public, agree with at least one conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Holy freaking mind blown crap. This that just seems crazy.
What kind of a bubble are we living in, I guess?
We are the most rational, sound people in the world.
What kind of rationalizing and biases are blinding me from seeing that in myself? Because for some reason, I had this idea like, no, I'm totally rational. I think that might just be total bullshit.
Well, which is the key piece that I think I'm taking out of this, right? Is if 50% of people are there, there's a likelihood that I might fall within that group, right? It's a 50-50 chance.
Good odds.
And yet, I don't feel like I am. But I wonder if those people who do hold these beliefs, if they feel like this is an oddball belief, but to that degree, they don't. and their brain is working overtime to say this is justified, this is the way it is, everybody else is thinking crazy, we're the ones who are sane. So just going in and saying, well, yeah, this feels right and is justified, and here are the facts behind it. Somebody believing in a flat earth, somebody believing in, the pedophile thing for Democrats, Ring, all of those, they have beliefs that are based on, faulty information, but they can call on that. And so in their own mind, it's justified.
And Eric, the definition that he gave it early in our discussion was that believing that the definition of the conspiracy theory is that believing there's something complicated, right, that's causing something else to happen, and accepting that as the explanation over a very plausible and empirically verifiable explanation.
Well, which is the thing, right? So the empirically verifiable, and I think part of the issue is that I think people are not our education system hasn't done a good job in teaching people the scientific method and to understand scientific data. And so you're extrapolating out from small n's, you're looking at correlational things and applying causal components to those. You're looking at a variety of different facets, and then you're just looking at a whole bunch of fake data out there that people are propagating. So all of those things I think are out there, but I think the important thing is for me to take away, and you as well, is this idea that we think we're not buying into conspiracy theories or magical thinking things, but are we? And to test and to come back, what was it? Steve Wendell said, start with this idea that everything we think of is wrong, right? Or everything we believe is wrong.
Systemic humility.
Yeah, systemic humility, and just go from that perspective. And what are the basis for why we think what we think? And and again, we often jump to a conclusion about something. If somebody says something, how many polar bears are there in the world? You automatically get have a number jump into your head or a range, right? And that's based on, if you're somebody who studies that's probably based on some factual evidence. If you're not, it isn't. And then we get anchored in, and then it gets really hard. So we need to always go back and just check our, what are we anchoring in on? And are we anchoring in on things that are verifiable and empirical? So.
Yeah. I'd like to just note that it's not that intuitionism in itself is bad and that rationalism in itself is good, right? Because we need both, right? We can't just be rational, right? We've talked about the experiments.
Mr. Spock, why can't we just be rational?
Because
he seemed to work really well.
Because the purely rational, the 100% rational side would end up in a never-ending loop of indecision, because there's always more data to grind on.
Yeah, and you go and you look at Antonio Damasio, and he's done a ton of research on this and looked at patients who have had those emotional areas of their brain where something has happened to them, and they get stuck in that analysis process. They can't decide which restaurant to go to because they're looking, should it steak place, the fish place? Well, let's look at this. And for most of us, we'll look at that, and we'll look at that rational information. It will be there. Oh, steak, fish. Okay, price points here, atmosphere here. All right, I'm going to go with my gut. We're going steak tonight, or we're going fish tonight.
Or honey, wouldn't it be nicer to sit in the place that serves steak tonight because that's more comfy and I just really feel like a more comfortable chair?
Yeah.
Nothing to do with the food itself. Yeah.
Right. It's just an emotional, intuitive response. Like, I asked my kids, right? I was like, what for, let's go here. I don't want to go there. Why? I just don't feel like it. That's how we respond.
Go ahead.
That's not bad.
It's not bad. On the other hand, the idea that 45% of Americans believe that the FDA is deliberately withholding cancer cures because of pressure from pharmaceuticals is a concern for me. I mean, you and I have worked with pharmaceuticals for many years, and these are not heinous, evil people that work there.
Right.
That's just, it's completely implausible to me that both the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry would be conspiring in that way. That just seems crazy.
Well, what is it? Occam's razor, right?
Yeah.
How does that go again? If I
we pull a small portion of the story out, and that misleads the rest of that doesn't tell the full story. We pull a fact out with our razor that slims just this tiny little bit that seems to indicate that this is what the whole story is about, but it's not.
Here, law of parsimony, the problem solving for entities should not be multiplied without necessity. Basically, look, the simpler answer is probably the one
better
that
one.
is
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the other little razor thing that we've quoted before? And
Hanlon's razor?
Hanlon's razor. That was the one I was looking for.
Yeah, that's probably a better.
Which is, don't attribute to malice what can be easily explained by stupidity or
right,
something like that,
exactly.
right? Which I think is a lot of this.
Yeah.
I loved. Sorry to jump in. Sorry about these rabbit holes, folks. But I loved his quote from his kid, because I think it really goes in. And talks to a lot of some of the underlying things that we're discussing here, right? When he is talking about comforting his child because he was scared about the monsters, in the closet, and then his son made this really wonderful, insightful comment, which is, if there are no monsters in the closet, then why am I still afraid? I mean, that is profound when you think about it. And it goes back to some work I know that Leon Festinger looked at when he was developing cognitive dissonance theory, and listened to Andy Luttrell, who, again, is an upcoming guest on the show, but he has a podcast called Opinion Science, and there's episode 20, which is on cognitive dissonance. This is where I'm pulling this from, where Leon looked at, there was some older research about this massive earthquake that happened up by in the Himalaya mountains, and it devastated some of the villages close in India there, but it was felt hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And afterwards, there are all these conspiracy theories throughout much of India about all these horrible things that are going to be happening. And they're looking and they're trying to explain this. And what they came up with is people were feeling afraid, but they couldn't necessarily attribute it. While they might have felt a little bit of the earthquake shocks, their buildings were still there, nobody died, nothing, the shops were still open, everything was there, but they still felt the sense of being afraid. So they had to justify that somehow. And so they justified it through conspiracy theories. And so again, if there are no monsters in the closet, then why am I still afraid? There must be monsters because I'm afraid. I have to justify that intuitive feeling that I have.
Here we are in the middle of a pandemic that is very difficult for us to get our heads around because it happens infrequently, but it happens on this massive scale because it's pandemic, it's global, and it leaves a lot of uncertainty in our lives. It's opened Pandora's box on uncertainty, and it's very hard to deal with. And especially when the science, the rational side, is struggling to keep up with good explanations.
Yeah.
And that only provides the seeds and the fertile ground for conspiracy theories to grow in.
And those explanations are changing, right? They're not only just like trying to find them. It's like, oh, here's one. Oh, wait, no, here's this, which is kind of contradictory. And so then people can point back to that. And again, go back to that education around science, people not understanding how the scientific method works, that you're gaining more and more and more knowledge, that any single point, any so-called truth is just a point in time, and that there's further insights that are going to be gained, and particularly given what's going on here. That's just crazy.
Okay, we could talk for an hour about Eric's stuff because it's fantastic, but I have a music question for you. So Eric is the first guy who said, I would rather have dinner with a sports figure, my sports hero, than with my music hero. And that shocked the daylights out of me, right? Because as like the music guy is like, what?
Because you're coming from a biased position.
Of course I am.
An intuitive position. Like, why would anybody want to talk to a sports guy? Musicians like me are so much more interesting.
Definitely. So that is my bias. It absolutely is. But here's the question for you. Which sports figure do you think would make for the greatest intellectual conversation?
Intellectual. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying which is the smartest sports figure out there?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Yeah. Just say it, damn it.
Okay.
I don't know. I know there are lots and lots of very smart sports figures out there. I do know Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, is insanely bright. I know he was on Jeopardy, and not that Jeopardy is this necessarily great indicator of knowledge, but he was on there with who is the astronaut and somebody
Mark
else.
Kelly?
And he beat them. So he's a smart guy. So intellectually, I bet that could be very interesting. Okay. Plus, I could ask about Dana Patrick and what she was like, and so there you go. It was his old girlfriend. They now broke up, Tim. So that just she's the race car driver, Indy 500 race car driver.
Who did the GoDaddy commercials.
Oh, which is how you know her. Right. There you go.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So I will. So musician, what musician would have the most intellectually stimulating conversation over dinner for you? Again, a roundabout way of saying which do you think is the smartest musician out there?
Yeah. Well, there are two that come to mind.
Okay.
One would be Yo-Yo Ma, because he's so articulate when he talks about things. He talks about issues in a way that is really wise. He's a very wise guy.
He's a wise guy?
He's not a wise guy. He's a wise man. And Bob Dylan, if you could like calm him down and get him away from the sort of the I'm a rock star and you're not kind of thing, away from the interview, but just actually to have a conversation. Dylan I think is a very, very smart guy.
Huh.
Very smart. Yeah. Those would be the two that come to mind. Okay.
All right.
Okay, folks, hang on. We're going to wrap up and move on to a bonus track, and I'll be bringing that to you in just a minute. Hey, Groovers. This is Tim with our bonus track and groove idea for the week. We found Eric's conversation nothing short of amazing and felt like we had several important takeaways from it. But here in the bonus track, we'll only list a few. First, conspiracy theories are widely held among people in the U.S., and they are closely linked to someone's willingness to believe in what Eric calls magical thinking. And even though roughly 50% of the U.S. population believes in some conspiracy theory, it was apparently contradicted by the idea that the majority of Americans are also not easily duped into believing things that aren't true. Kind of a head scratcher. Second, we really like the discussion about intuitionism as a polarizing aspect in politics. It made a lot of sense to us, and we think it's a powerful lens to view our current political struggles through. Lastly, we were reminded of the benefits and pitfalls of using emotions to make our decisions. The more emotional our decisions become, the less we need facts. While that may sound troublesome, we can't eliminate emotions or heuristics from our decision-making. The world is just too complex to rely on pure rationality. Our groove idea for the week is this. Give some consideration to the way you process the world. To what degree do you buy into some magical thinking in your life? Is it a lot or a little? More importantly, where would you like it to be? Would you like to dial up your intuitionism or dial it down? Let us know what you think, and thanks for listening in, Groovers. We hope you go out and make it a great week.